Hi, everyone. We're going to just wait a minute while we get people to join. Welcome, welcome, everyone. We're just waiting for people to sign on, and then we'll start in a second. Right, so welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending today. My name is Scott Sinclair. I'm the Senior Manager of Programs at Cancer and Careers, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to go through about accreditation. Today's webinar is accredited by ANCC, NASW, New York State Education Department State Board of Social Work, the California Board of Registered Nursing, and the Society of Human Resource Management. If you plan on requesting continuing education credits for the program from any of these accrediting bodies, please proceed with the following steps. First, you must log in individually. Participants who listen in on someone else's line will not receive credit. Second, you must complete and submit the evaluation and post-test, as well as receive a passing grade on the post-test. Following today's session, you'll receive an email with all this information. The follow-up email will be sent no later than 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, July 7th, and certificates will be emailed within 4 weeks. Also, please note that the planners and presenters from this program have not disclosed any pertinent financial relationships or conflicts of interest, and that no commercial support was provided for this program. Thanks in part to the direct support of Genentech, HSN, and QVC, Cancer and Careers have been able to offer this program for the 8th year. The program was created to provide patients and survivors, as well as their care teams and employees, with concise, targeted information about the work-related issues that arise after a cancer diagnosis. Additionally, we'd like to recognize Cancer and Careers as year-round sponsors who support all of our core programs and allow us to continue providing all resources and services free of charge. Today's session, Balancing Work and Cancer, will explore issues that sit at the very heart of the conversation about employment after a diagnosis. What information does one need to make good decisions about work? What considerations are there when deciding whether or not to disclose at an existing job or during a job search? How do you manage side effects while working or address comments from coworkers? Over the next hour, we'll discuss all of these questions and more. To help us explore this topic, I'm delighted to introduce Rachel Becker. Rachel is the Deputy Director of Cancer and Careers and one of our in-house social workers. She's been at CAC for 8 years, having previously worked as head of client services at Care Planners, as well as in a clinical capacity at New York Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, as well as the Jewish Child Care Association of New York, and completed a fellowship in psycho-oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. At the end of the webinar, there will be a question and answer period. Any questions that you would like answered should be submitted into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Please do not ask Rachel questions in the chat box, as they will most likely be missed. If you are joining us via phone today, you can press *9, which will alert us of your question. Now I will hand it over to Rachel to get us started.
Thanks so much, Scott. Okay, so as you know, the topic for today's webinar is balancing work and cancer. And as we get started, I would imagine that all of you who are tuned in today are in different places in terms of your cancer experience. Some of you on the line might have just gotten a diagnosis, maybe are pre-treatment. Others might be well into treatment or have gotten all the way through to the other side. We may have healthcare professionals, employers, caregivers, friends, and loved ones. Maybe you're even a coworker of someone who has received a diagnosis in your workplace. But wherever you are in terms of your own story and your reasons for joining us today, you can probably relate to the idea that for most people, the questions around how work factors in after receiving a diagnosis become really important. And it can be challenging, overwhelming even, to look at the big picture of how life, including your job, are going to continue when you're also focused on addressing a health crisis? All of those unknowns can feel very understandably concerning and overwhelming. And it's important in these moments when feeling this way to acknowledge the reality of what's going on and know that it's okay to be having a lot of feelings, and then to start to isolate and answer some specific questions so that you can start to have more of a sense of feeling in control and illuminate what the best path forward for you is going to be. And when it comes to balancing work and cancer, there are two overarching questions that can really be a great jumping off place to start to figure out what your path is going to be. And those questions are, first, how important is work to you personally? And then the second is, what information do you need to have, perhaps physically in front of you, in order to make a good decision about work? And again, this consideration might happen when you're newly diagnosed and trying to create your initial roadmap through a landscape that includes work. Oh, excuse me, a little trigger happy with the mouse there. As I was saying, so these considerations might be made when you're newly diagnosed and first starting to make decisions with that initial roadmap that includes work. But these are also questions that you may be asking yourself throughout your treatment experience at various different points into your post-treatment experience as well. Because as you continue to figure out what is realistic and what is comfortable, and of course, to identify what your specific preferences are when it comes to working. Now, from there, numerous other questions start to arise. The first, of course, is thinking about how treatment may affect work and schedule. So are you going to need time off for surgery or for chemotherapy or radiation? What might that look like? How can you plan for that strategically so that it works well with whatever is happening for you in terms of your job, not just what you need to do for your job, but maybe things that you want to do. Think about where there might be periods of productivity versus periods of fatigue. For example, do you know that you're likely to have an immediate set of side effects that show up from your chemotherapy treatment? If that's the case, maybe you try to schedule those to happen on a Friday so that the weekend is right there, that you can take time off and recover. If there's a delayed reaction, maybe you think about having a treatment on a Wednesday because you know the fatigue is going to be the worst when you get to Friday. And so that's when you're going to want the weekend. But thinking about that and being articulate with your healthcare team so that you're expressing what your needs are around your job and taking an active role in planning out how treatment happens for you, if you can. Also thinking about what actually goes into a work week for you. So for example, do you have a commute? If you are somebody who works a 9-to-5 job, but you have a 90-minute commute in both directions during rush hour traffic, that, 9-to-5 workday is actually 7:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., which is 11 hours. And so is that something that you're realistically going to be able to continue to do as the side effects of treatment continue to build, which they do often for people? And then, of course, no person is only their diagnosis and their job. So what else is there that goes into your work week? Do you have responsibilities around the house, an elderly parent that you're taking care of, or kids who need help with their homework? Maybe you're taking a watercolor painting class and it is so relaxing and it's really something that you enjoy and could be a good coping mechanism as you're going through this stressful time. How do you continue to break out your schedule so that you can invest in the things that are going to help you? We all have this internal pool of resources, the amount of energy that we have, and we divide that up. We make choices about how we're going to divide that up to and invest that in the things that have meaning in our life. That pie often starts to shrink when as treatment goes along. And so you may find yourself needing to make ongoing choices about how you're going to divide things up so that you can continue to be the robust human that you are. Also thinking about how flexible your work environment is. And this, of course, is something that so many people have learned about during the pandemic. We're going to talk more about this as we go through this presentation. But of course, it's also important to consider, what financial and insurance needs might be. If you're thinking about that question of whether you're going to work during treatment, of how much you might work, that can often be a key decision driver for people. Often they're there's no choice but to continue to work to generate income or to generate your health insurance coverage, right? But it's also important to keep in mind that it's not true for everybody, or maybe it's somewhere on the scale of importance, but not the most important thing, particularly in this country, in the US, where we are so closely identified with our jobs, or we tend to be. Not everyone is, but think about what we ask people when we meet them for the first time. So frequently we say, what do you do? And that can be a really profound question, and it can be emotionally challenging if suddenly we find ourselves in a situation where our work lives are changing and we're not entirely sure how to answer it. So, acknowledge that, know that that is a realistic possibility for a way that you might be feeling. It's completely valid and understandable. And also keep in mind that talking to your healthcare team about how you feel around this can be really helpful. They can help you come up with some strategies for taking care of yourself emotionally during this time. Now, you'll remember on the last slide, I mentioned gathering information as an important component. And this slide breaks down into 3 buckets, the types of information that you might want to collect. So the first, of course, is medical and treatment details. We already talked about that a little bit on the last slide, getting information about recovery times and so on. That, of course, is best gathered from your healthcare team. The second bucket is workplace information. So this is going to include details like leave and insurance policies, again, pre-existing flexibility options. And then the third bucket has to do with legal fact finding and getting some information in advance about laws that you might be entitled to in your workplace. And we bring this up not because we think a situation is likely to become litigious at work, but rather because, as I mentioned, there are workplace laws that often provide protections. We don't tend to think of laws in that way in this country. We often think of laws as things that might be a little bit scary, that we want to stay on the right side of. Can definitely be challenging to think about. We don't, for many of us, to think about the law coming into play in our workplace. But one of the things I want to do today is kind of cut through that and help you start to see one law in particular as providing tools, that can be very, very useful, often the critical factor in helping you decide whether or how working through treatment is going to come together for you. So that key law that I want to talk to you about today is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And again, my goal here is to give you a little background on the ADA, so you know that it is something that can be looked into further based on your own situation. And I also want to quickly mention that I am not an attorney. As Scott mentioned, I am a social worker. I do have an understanding of what the law is and how it works, but if you have specific questions, we always encourage you to reach out to a legal expert to find answers about how the law may or may not apply for you as an individual. And if you are curious about how to find someone, you can reach out to us at Cancer and Careers, and we can put you in touch with some free legal resources. So back to the law. To start with, the ADA is a federal law. So that means that it applies in all 50 states. And the part that is relevant to work comes from Title I. And like all laws, it has certain requirements that must be met in order to use it. So in broad strokes, those requirements are, first, that your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. You must have the necessary skills, certifications, and qualifications to do the job, and your disability must meet the criteria determined by the ADA. And if you meet all of those requirements, the ADA protects you from discrimination. It may also provide access to reasonable accommodations. We're going to talk about reasonable accommodations later on. And again, this is just a quick overview so that you are aware that the ADA is something that you may want to consider. Also important to note that you may be further protected by fair employment laws that exist in your state. So also helpful to take a look at those. And again, if you're interested in learning more, if you're interested in contacting a legal professional, you can reach out to Cancer and Careers and we will help point you in the right direction. Now, before we move into our conversation about actual physical workspaces or virtual workspaces, so many of us are in virtual workspaces these days, but I want to talk about broadly about the online space and specifically about the way that the role that it can have in thinking about disclosure in a workplace. So at Cancer and Careers, we often hear from people who have received a diagnosis about the role that the internet is playing in helping them through whatever experiences they might be having. For many, it creates a sense of community, a way to feel better in the moment, but it can also create a written record of information that may be difficult to get rid of. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying never post anything online, since it can actually be good to have an online presence. But rather, it is important for everyone to have a strong understanding of the virtual landscape in order to make informed choices about how their story is being presented online. And this is in part because we know that hiring managers and current employers, both of them, Google their prospective candidates and the people who work for them, respectively. This is not necessarily done to find something negative. It's often done to confirm something that, well, in the case of hiring managers, it's often done because they like a candidate on paper. They like how they look. Maybe they had a good interview and they want to find out more information about them. In the case of managers, it's often done because they want to better understand the people who work for them as people so that they can have more human moments rather than just be seen as a supervisor. But regardless of what the intentions are, of course, Googling someone can lead to the discovery of information that that person might have preferred not be made public in the place where they work. And so at this point, some of you are probably asking yourselves, well, but what about privacy settings? I mean, I set my Facebook account to private. Doesn't that mean that my account is protected? And that is a great question. So what's important to think about when it comes to the major social media sites like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok is that there's certainly steps that can be taken towards, there certainly are steps that have been taken in recent years towards strengthening privacy. And since I started at Cancer and Careers 8 years ago, some sites have even gotten better about communicating what the privacy realities are within those platforms. However, making sure that your profile is as locked down as it can be is still a pretty extensive process. There's also complexity, like if you think about something like Facebook, there's complexity in terms of what happens when friends tag you in posts or if they repost something that you shared initially. And then it's also key to know that official privacy policies for these sites are ever changing, because the way that they make money is by selling data to advertisers. So they're always updating the rules in order to be able to make new deals and continue to operate without us having to pay for them. So essentially, what we recommend is that you check privacy policies on any website before posting, whether it's Facebook or a blogging website or a chat forum. But the upshot here is that privacy settings do not guarantee Fort Knox level protection. Now, with that said, there are some online platforms that can be more secure. We've got 2 of them listed on this slide. my lifeline and caring bridge, which I'm guessing that many of you are already familiar with, if not all of you. For those of you who don't know them, they're specifically designed for people who are going through a health-related experience to communicate with their friends and family members and the people they invite in, and they tend to be more protected than mainstream sites. There are a few steps that need to be taken in order to lock them down as much as they can be. At the bottom of the slide, you will see a link to a guide that we've created to maintaining online privacy on My Lifeline and Caring Bridge. So good to know about those options. There's also a very effective step you can take to protect your privacy before ever even sitting down at a keyboard or opening an app. And that is to develop a personal disclosure plan. So this includes making clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're going to share, both online and off, and also where you are going to share it in terms of specific websites or blogs. And as you're thinking through what's going to work best for you, it's a good idea to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosure. Now, it may be the case that some of you have disclosed at work and everyone is being really supportive, and that's an outstanding situation to be in. But the fact is that the internet doesn't go away. So it's important to think beyond right now and consider possible long-term impacts, even if you're in an outstanding current situation. And that's because none of us can predict the future. So you may find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now, or your supportive supervisor might move on and be replaced by somebody who starts Googling their new staff. And there's no way to know how that person is going to respond to the information they find. Then, of course, once you've made decisions, it's important to communicate them with the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people you've connected to online. Share your preferences, and then so that they know what you feel comfortable with them sharing or not sharing. And finally, it's key to remember that even if you're past that moment of initial consideration, you can redefine your disclosure and communication preferences at any time, rather. And while it might not change what's already out there, there can still be value in making new and different choices. So there are also plenty of opportunities to take control of what comes up about you in searches. And that's by taking a strategic approach to what you post online. People don't know about you what you don't share with them. And in a work context, social media is a forum where you can not only tell, but also show people who you are as a professional. So this slide has some tips about how to take control of your online brand, Googling yourself, being deliberate about what you post on certain platforms so that newer, fresher posts that illustrate who you are go to the top. And of course, it's also important to consider what you're posting before you post it. So we've got some questions on this slide to help you think through deliberately what you might share before it goes up so that you can feel confident about the story that you are telling about yourself online. Okay. So now we're going to transition from the online space to thinking broadly, to thinking about workplaces. And I want to start by showing you some data points, which are drawn from a survey that we did in 2021 with Harris Interactive. And we do this poll every year, every other year, because we think it's really important to hear directly from people who have lived the experience of work after a diagnosis. And what we hear survey after survey is that there is a diversity of reasons that people want to work or continue working after they are diagnosed. So we put the top 5 that came up in 2021 on this slide. There are people who do say health insurance and a paycheck, of course, but what this survey always supports year over year is that those are not the only reasons that people want to continue working after a diagnosis. And in 2021 specifically, those 2 things did not come up in the top 5, which is always interesting. That said, our employers, our healthcare providers, sometimes even our family members think that the drive to work really is solely rooted in those very critical and practical needs. I mentioned this a little bit earlier as well. But we do know that it is so much more than that. The drive is so much more than that. And when we don't account for the wider range of reasons that people need to and want to work, we miss out on things. And then I also want to call to your attention that at the bottom of this slide, you can see that the people that we surveyed in 2021, a very high number of them indicated that working during treatment helped them to cope, or it helped in their recovery. It aided in their, oh, I'm sorry, we have a different one here. I apologize, my talking points don't line up with this. Sorry, they agreed that work helped them to cope and that it was critical to their recovery. That was how this was phrased. So again, really speaking to the idea that there is value in work beyond the paycheck. So if this resonates with you or someone that you know, we offer for you that you are not alone. They are not alone. Now, this is a question that we get asked a lot at Cancer and Careers. Do I have to share the news of my diagnosis at a workplace? And it's very understandable that people are often confused about whether or not there is a responsibility, a legal responsibility to disclose and discuss their diagnosis or treatment plan at work. So you're wondering if whether or not you have to share the news of your diagnosis. You should know that although there can be exceptions, in most instances, there is not a requirement or an obligation to share your details about health or health history with an employer, nor can they ask. Again, this is in most instances, there can be exceptions. However, many people, despite this, do decide to disclose for a variety of reasons. Oops, I'm so sorry. There's a wheel on my mouse and I keep hitting it with my finger and it keeps making the slides go faster than I want them to. So you may want to ask yourself whether there are any legal benefits to disclosing. So again, accessing something under the ADA might be a good example of a reason why you would have to disclose perhaps some information. There also might be an interpersonal benefit to disclosing. So for example, some people are sharers. It may feel really unnatural not to say anything. Other people feel completely the opposite. And of course, this is a spectrum, so people may feel somewhere in between. But the point is that you want to evaluate how you feel about sharing information when you're thinking about whether or not you want to. There may also be practical benefits to disclosing. So for example, if someone has been working hard to improve their performance after getting a bad review at work, they may want to share what's going on with their supervisor so that that supervisor doesn't have any concerns that they're backsliding. So for example, if you're experiencing fatigue or perhaps trouble focusing, talking to a supervisor and saying, hey, just so you know, this is why this is happening, can help to really put some context around the circumstance. There are some other things to consider under the umbrella of disclosing in a workplace. And when we think about whom to tell, the culture or how to tell, or all of these questions, some things to think through. So the culture of the workplace might factor into your decision making. There are some people for whom their coworkers are like a second family. They are always sharing stories about grandkids or pets. If this is you, if this sounds like your workplace, you may feel very comfortable disclosing in a way that is very open and upfront. You might have no hesitations about sharing the news. Conversely, some people work in very buttoned up environments that are strictly focused on work. Maybe they're very competitive corporate environments, and you may decide that you don't want to share anything or only share information if it becomes relevant. You may also want to think about whether anyone in your workplace has gone through something similar. So maybe you don't know of somebody who specifically went through cancer treatment, but perhaps there's someone who went out on maternity leave, or somebody who has an aging parent and you know that they pop out to take them to appointments or sometimes, take a day off. How has that gone? What kind of flexibilities did the workplace provide for them? How is the information received by managers, by others members of the team? If you know that information, you might not, but thinking through what others in your environment have experienced can be a helpful way to strategize what your specific approach is going to be. Now, when we go to that question of who should I tell, it's going to vary depending on you, depending on your specific circumstance. Important to know that you may have to have more than one disclosure conversation. So keep that in your head as you're planning out how these are going to go. If you can start with the person that you feel like it's the easiest to talk to, that is often a good decision, because that first conversation, putting it outside of your head and into the world, can often be the most challenging one. So if you can, if that option is available to you, we recommend that you take it. The supervisors are often the person that someone feels the most comfortable disclosing to, because we talk to our supervisors frequently. They are the people who understand our workloads. They're the people who can help us come up with plans for how work might be redistributed or what the time off schedule is going to look like, et cetera, et cetera. But it's important to bear in mind that not all managers are trained to be managers. Very often we hear from people in our community who sit down with their supervisor to have a conversation, and it turns out that both of them are having that conversation for the first time. And so the person with the diagnosis then feels like there's a burden on them to educate their employer about what cancer is, what treatment is, things along those lines. Often they may not even know what protections are available for the employees. So to help with that, Cancer and Careers has created a manager's toolkit. It was based on requests that we got from people in these circumstances. And so there is a link at the bottom of the slide for you to download that. It can be helpful to carry that into those conversations, hand it to your manager and say, hey, this may be useful. And thank you, Tiffany. We think the manager's toolkit is awesome too. So for some people, talking to their supervisors is going to be out of the question. Maybe they don't have a good relationship with that person. It may also be the case that you're in a workplace where there is a requirement for you to go to HR to first start having these conversations. So always a good idea to figure out if that is the case in your workplace. If you have an HR department, not everyone does. We don't at Cancer and Careers, for example. HR departments can be a font of information because they understand employer policies. They may have experience with others who have been in similar circumstances, but we also know both anecdotally and through research that there can be hesitancy towards HR as well. They straddle a complex line in terms of both protecting the company and administering benefits and enforcing policies. So that is something to keep in mind as well if you're thinking about going to HR. But perhaps the most important thing to mention in any of these conversations, regardless of who you're having them with, is the idea that treatment is going to be fluid. You want to aim to help others understand that whatever it is that you're sharing today is what you know today. They may not apply next week, it may not apply next month or 6 months from now, and it is likely to be an ongoing conversation. You want to try to avoid giving your employer the impression that anything is set in stone, because trust me, it can be very uncomfortable to have to walk back promises that you made early on before you knew how things were going to play out. It's a much safer option. It sets you up better for the unknown if you come out of the gate by saying, listen, this is what I'm thinking, but we might have to revisit this later. So with all of that said, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling on these conversations is one that is intimidating to so many people, and that is very understandable. So on this slide, we have a couple examples for how you might start a conversation. I'm not going to read them, but overall, important to think about as you're planning the language that's going to work for you, that's going to feel natural coming out of your mouth. You want to weave in the idea that your goal is to collaborate with your employer to create a plan that ensures both your needs and their needs are being met. That's going to help the conversation go much more smoothly. People are more receptive during difficult conversations if we can lay out the foundation that this is going to be a two-way street, that we know that we're not the only person in the situation who's coming in with concerns and obligations and things that we need to do or things that we can't do. So acknowledging right off the bat that, like, hey, let's work together. I'm going to talk about what's going on with me. You tell me what's going on with you. Perhaps I've already done, maybe come to the conversation having done some thinking about how things might work for the employer. It can really smooth over and help to keep the dialogue from becoming tense as it's going along. So as we think about disclosure, it's also important to consider what possible side effects you may experience, because even if your words, if you're choosing not to use your words to disclose anything, or if you're disclosing only a little bit, the changes that your body go through during treatment, whether they're visible side effects like hair loss or skin changes, or invisible side effects such as cognitive changes or a decrease in energy levels, those can often disclose something, even if your words don't. So for those of you who are tending towards being more private, it can be a good idea to have a sense of the type of changes ahead of time, so that you can prepare for any comments that may come from coworkers, so that you don't accidentally share information that you prefer to keep private. So if any of you are wondering what I mean by preparing responses, stick with me. I promise you're going to leave this session with some examples of how to do that. But right now, I just want to plant the seed that, as with disclosure conversations that are, you're sitting down to drive, being prepared with responses to things that might come up can also go a long way in helping you stay in control of your narrative. So while we're on this topic, I want to spend some time talking about side effects and how to manage them. And most importantly, on that note, the side effect that we hear about most frequently is chemo brain. It is not to say that there aren't others that are profoundly important, and can have a really big emotional impact as well. So, I'm going to talk about chemo brain because it comes up frequently. If you have questions about other side effects, please throw them into the Q&A box. And again, in no way taking away from whatever side effects you might be feeling and feeling challenged by. But when it comes to chemo brain specifically, that can include trouble focusing, struggling to process information, difficulty remembering the steps of a task that were once second nature. But there are some practical solutions that can help ease some of these challenges. So the first recommendation we have is that you forget multitasking and focus on one task at a time. Don't try to do everything all at once. It can take you down paths. You can get lost in rabbit holes. Really do your best to try to focus on one thing at a time. And you can assist in this by writing down a list of priorities. And by this, I mean truly capture what exactly you need to do so that you can actually get through that list, and know what you accomplished, having that record to look back to, because sometimes you may find that you don't even remember what you did over the course of the day, but having that list can help refresh your memory. And really be specific. It might not be good enough to say, I need to finish the report. What does that actually mean, right? Say pages 10 to 12 still need to be proofread. John from accounting needs to take a look at the chart on page 17, and then I need to do X, Y, and Z. Break it down. Put all of those items on the to-do list so you can tick them off a reel and move on to the next one. Minimize distractions. That can make a big difference in helping to improve your focus. Turn off email or phone. Focus on one thing at a time. You might even want to set a meeting with yourself so that your boss or your coworkers know that you're busy. That way that you won't feel obligated to respond immediately to emails or instant messages that might come up. Rehearsing presentations, rehearsing conversations, keeping your workplace free from clutter. So if you work at a desk, believe it or not, having piles of things everywhere, that can actually draw your focus, and it can prevent you from being able to concentrate. And then there's also research that supports that stepping away from what you're doing, actually taking a break to walk around the office or the block, can help you to refocus. So build those into your day if you can. It's also helpful to take some time to think about how to communicate with supervisors and coworkers or as your needs start to change. So asking your supervisor what their priorities are. So when you're creating your prioritized list, you know that you're in line with what everybody else is thinking, what your supervisor's thinking is best for the day. And also knowing your limits and setting boundaries. And this is a topic that we talk about a lot at Cancer and Careers. In fact, we have a full hour-long webinar on this subject that's archived on our website. But it's important to remember that, so what I'll say for today is that it's important to remember that the way that we communicate at work is different than how we communicate at home. And you want to be communicating in ways that feel professional. So if you have to say no to something, we encourage framing it in a way that looks like the phrases you see on the slide right now. We call them the professional no. And it doesn't necessarily mean acknowledging the cancer specifically, right? We're all human. Everybody who works is human, and humans all have limitations. And so this is actually a great skill for everyone to have, but perhaps even more so if you're going through some sort of experience, such as a cancer diagnosis. And, it involves basically acknowledging that you appreciate being seen as a capable person who is asked to do something extra. But if you don't have time on your plate, saying something like, I've got a lot going on. I'm actually concerned about my ability to get this back to you in the deadline that you're specifying. Maybe even also throwing in there that, think of me in the future. I'd love to be considered again. But again, it's about keeping it professional, keeping it light, and knowing that all humans have limitations, and all humans need to say no sometimes, regardless of what their health status is. Okay, so as we think about some of these challenges, I want to start now to talk about reasonable accommodations. And essentially what these are, we mentioned them a little bit earlier when I was talking about the ADA, and they are modifications to your job or schedule or to the environment in which you work that makes it possible for you to perform your essential duties. And we're going to go over a few examples now to show you how reasonable accommodations work generally, so that you can be prepared to identify if they will work for you. And again, remember, I'm not an attorney. This is all just to get you thinking. So our first example is a woman that we met at Cancer and Careers a few years back. She was a social worker, and she truly loved her job, and work was a really big part of how she was coping with her treatment. However, as that treatment went on, she found herself becoming increasingly incredibly nauseated when she was at work. And of course, that's not an unusual side effect of treatment, but what was unusual was that she did not feel that way when she was at home in the evenings or on the weekends. It was only during her work hours, Monday through Friday. So we sat down with her, we asked her a number of questions, and we eventually discovered that her office was located outside of the cafeteria. So that meant that the smell of the cooking food kept wafting in, and that was what was making her feel unwell. So for her, the reasonable accommodation was to change offices to be further away from the cafeteria. It didn't make working through treatment a breeze, but it did eliminate that side effect. Our next example is a gentleman named Frank. He worked in the finance department at the company that employed him, and his job required him printing a lot of documents. And for whatever reason, the printer that his computer was connected to was 2 floors down from where his desk was. So every time he printed a document, he needed to go down 2 flights of stairs and then up 2 flights of stairs. And as the fatigue set in, this became more challenging. So for him, the reasonable accommodation was to get a printer that could sit near his desk so that he could preserve his energy to focus on the actual work that he needed to do. And as you'll see from these 2 examples, there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to reasonable accommodations. And on this slide, we have a number of questions that you can ask yourself to identify other potential accommodations. Again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to run through this right now, but it's really about coming up with ideas that are both creative and practical. Now, if we think about returning to work after taking time off, there can be some challenges involved, whether you've been away for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or more. And there are pros and cons of returning to a former job. Probably the biggest pro is that it's a familiar landscape. You know the culture, you know the quirks, you know your colleagues, and you know the responsibilities that are associated with your particular job. And all of these things mean you won't have to spend a lot of time figuring out or acclimating to your new environment. But there are also some cons. And one is that very sneaky and sometimes insidious before picture. Meaning, you know, saying, well, it used to take me this amount of time to do something, and then finding that it takes longer. And what I want to remind you is that it is important. In fact, it's even okay to ease back into the routine. It's often easier said than done, but again, it's a helpful seed to have planted in the back of your mind. Take your time, pause and think about things. If you need to contextualize what's going on for your supervisor or your team, definitely do that. But it is normal. What you're going through happens frequently, and don't let that before picture get you down. Now, we also hear frequently from patients and survivors about comments that their coworkers are making that make them feel uncomfortable. And what we recommend in these circumstances is a speech pattern that we call the swivel. And it involves acknowledging a statement that was made that made you feel uncomfortable, cancer-related comment, and then inserting an and in there and swiveling the conversation to an area where you feel more comfortable communicating. Again, no one size fits all here. You're going to want to come up with language that works for you. But what makes this such an effective tool is the fact that people tend to pick up the conversation where we leave it off from. And I'm going to go through a few more examples of what a swivel might look like. So there are a whole spectrum in the types of comments that you may encounter in the workplace. So these include questions that may unfortunately be a bit off-putting. So perhaps your boss says to you, you know, you've been looking so exhausted recently that I didn't want to overwhelm you by adding more to your plate. This is something that sounds very well intended, but if you are not exhausted, maybe you just look exhausted and really are appreciating the distraction that work provides, you might respond by saying, you know, I appreciate your concern, but work is a key part of my overall well-being. And in fact, last night I had some ideas about the project that I'd love to share with you. And then you go into sharing those ideas. So right now, this person has taken back control of the conversation and led the other person to another place. There are also comments that are just outright insensitive, such as the example that you see on this slide. And I'm not going to read through this full example because it's a lot of copy. I encourage you to do that. But what it really drives home, what this slide really drives home, is that it can be useful to sit down and think personally about how you might respond if someone makes a comment like this. You may even want to write it down and practice saying it out loud so that if you do find yourself in a situation where you need to address an insensitive comment, the words feel comfortable coming out of your mouth. And again, this is an area where social workers can be really helpful for practicing these scenarios. And a lot of people feel like role playing is silly sometimes, but it can be an incredibly helpful piece that makes a big difference. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about the job search. We have many webinars archived on our website that go into this topic, so I'm not going to take too deep a dive, but I want to make sure that we do give you some critical information here. And so we start with some data points from our 2021 Harris survey. And what you can see at the top of the slide are some points from patients and survivors who are looking for work. And what they really do, these findings really validated the fact that there are concerns, that people have concerns about looking for work after cancer. And then when we look at the bottom of the slide, we have some external research that shows that those concerns, we know that there is a foundation for them. In a study with fake cover letters, it was found that people who disclosed a disability or a cancer diagnosis had a lower chance of being called in for an interview than people who did not. And so I'm sharing this information with you not to scare you or to paint a negative picture, but so that you have the information in the back of your mind. Because again, we want you to be the savviest candidate that you can be during your job search. So you want to make strategic choices. I've certainly spoken with people over the years who have disclosed something about their cancer status during a job search and they've still gotten hired. I'm not saying never do it, but you want to be informed and you want to make sure that you're making smart choices. Job searches, overall, they're up and down experiences. They can feel scary regardless of who you are, regardless of what you've accomplished in your life, regardless of what your health history is. But strategy can help to balance out some of the emotions. Sometimes when we're feeling too much, the antidote to that can be thinking and planning. And so that is something I want to encourage you to do, to make strategic choices. But again, talking to social workers, talking to the people around you, getting those feelings out can also be profoundly helpful. There are also some things to consider if you are searching right now in the current reality of our pandemic. So besides practical questions like which companies are hiring, what jobs are available, you may also want to think about safety measures and policies that employers have in place if exposure is a concern for you. It's going to likely be unique to your situation. So think about what you're comfortable with. Talk to your healthcare provider about anything that is specifically concerning to you. And then of course, do personal gut checks as you're going along about what you're hearing from potential employers. Now, when we think about looking for work, the best approach to finding new job opportunities, according to some of our career coaches, is that networking is really the way to go. In fact, the statistic that gets tossed around is more than 85% of jobs are found through other people. Obviously, not exclusively the way people do find their jobs through jobs posting. In fact, that's how most of Cancer and Careers got their jobs. But by and large, networking is a necessary part of the job searching process. It is the best way to find opportunities. And what I really want to encourage you here is to not think about who your network is too narrowly. Your network can really be anyone. It can be members of your religious community. It can be your dentist. It can be the person that you always find yourself standing behind in line for coffee at Starbucks every day. The idea is to get good at talking about the fact that you're looking for work, finding out from people what they can do, figuring out how you can build relationships that are mutually beneficial in terms of work. LinkedIn is a great resource for networking. We have a full webinar on our website about building an effective LinkedIn profile. There's a link to it at the bottom of the page. Check that out. But the big takeaway on this slide is networking, networking, networking. That said, it's also important to have updated resumes and cover letters. We've got some tips for those on this slide. We also have a resume review service, which I want to point you towards as well on our website. It is free. That can help get your resume into great shape. We have a job search toolkits with lots of tips and tools. So this slide is really just a reminder for you that those time-tested tools are still really critical. And we did talk a little bit about disclosure and some of the challenges that can come with disclosing during a job search. This is a question that we get asked frequently, should I do it? And the first response that we give is always, you want to do whatever you're comfortable with. But remember as well that cover letters, resumes, job interviews, there are limitations that sit around these things, right? You only have so much time in an interview. You only have so much space in a cover letter. They should be short and succinct. And so it is a good strategic choice to focus on talking about what makes you the most qualified candidate for the job. Past experiences and successes you've had at work, passions and interests that you have, talking about those things can really set you up well to be called in for an interview. That said, it's entirely possible that you will be asked about a gap on a resume during an interview, and this is an opportunity for you to swivel. So, examples on this slide. Can you tell me what you were doing during this gap on your resume? Well, yes, I was dealing with a family issue that is resolved now, and I am thrilled to discuss how my management skills can help build the team and grow your business. So you can see classic swivel here. The comment has been acknowledged and the conversation driven around to where the person is talking about what makes them a savvy candidate, right? They've driven the conversation to a new place where they're more in control. And again, leaving out the cancer diagnosis is something that you can do. This person broadly acknowledges that there was a big life issue going on. The point of somebody asking about any question that they're asking during an interview should be to figure out if you were the best candidate. That's the information that they really want. They're not trying to play gotcha in terms of finding out what's sitting behind the gap on your resume. So the swivel can really be your friend here. And then, of course, it's important to research an employer before you go in for an interview. And this is not just so that you can talk about why you're such a great candidate for the job, but so you can have an understanding of who they are, maybe what kind of benefits are available. And you might find that out by, asking someone that you networked through to get your interview. Maybe go to glassdoor.com and see what employees are saying, or if someone is tweeting about what their experience is in the workplace. Getting hired for a job is often like walking into a long-term relationship. And so you want to have a sense of who you're making that commitment to. So do the fact finding about what benefits you might have access to. Do you have protections under the ADA because we know the employer is big enough, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the kind of questions you want to be looking into. And then, of course, the goal of any job search is to find a new job, to find yourself working with a new employer. And there are pros and cons to this as well. One of the best things about starting a new job is that it's a fresh start. Nobody knows what you're bringing to the table unless you share it with them. And that includes both what you went through, what you may still be going through in terms of your health, but also in terms of what you offer as a candidate. They have a sense of what you offer as a candidate. That's what they've hired you, but it's your opportunity to show what you're really made of. And keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to do that by coming out of the gate working 80 hours a week. Showing who you are as a person goes a long way as well. Ask good questions. Get to know your coworkers as human beings and show them that you're a delight to be around, that you're a contributor, that you're a team player. Ask for feedback and integrate that feedback as you're going along. Show that you're open to learning, right? Open to growing. And keep in mind that employers hire the candidate that they think are best for the job. They don't hire people with the hopes of watching them fail. They are invested in making sure that you are successful in your job. So don't let the voice in your head convince you of anything else, and really take advantage of the opportunities that are available to help you do a better job. So I'm going to turn this over to Scott for Q&A, to lead us into Q&A and through some last slides quickly, because I know we're running long on time.
Thank you, Rachel. That was so insightful and informative, and I hope everyone's getting a lot out of this today. Before we go to Q&A, I just want to point out a few upcoming events we have here at Cancer and Careers. We have webinars throughout the year, once a month in this series. We're also starting a new Spanish language Ask the Expert series, which will be 4 moderated Q&As focused on work-related issues after a diagnosis. And those will be presented in Spanish. So we hope we can help spread the word for that. We also have our registration opened for our West Coast conference, which will be taking place on Saturday, October 22nd. And we hope you can join us for that. You'll have a lot more of this information and a lot of great speakers and panels. And then we also, on the next slide, we have some job search resources for you. You should have gotten a copy of this deck in the reminder email, but if not, just shoot us an email. We can send these to you. And then on the final slide, we have some financial resources, including our financial assistance grant program. Applications are currently paused for that program, but there's a sign up on our website that you can add your name to be notified when they open back up. And then some additional resources with employment and legal information is also on that last slide. So we are technically out of time, but anyone who wants to stay around will do a couple questions. Rachel, if you have time for us.
Absolutely.
So the first one I have here is, I have a really hard time putting work aside to take time for my mental health and chores. I feel so much responsibility. Any suggestions on how to draw the line? How much is too much?
It's a great question. And I think it's something that a lot of us struggle with. We actually just did a session on self-care at our recent national conference. And so I will share some of the insight that got discussed there. I think the first way that you draw the line is by just knowing that it is possible to draw the line. So often, what's standing in the way of us putting things aside is us believing that we actually can put things aside. And the fact is that usually the moment where you feel like you can't possibly take a break is exactly the moment where you need to. And often walking away for just 5 minutes will actually set you up better to do all of the things that you need to do than not taking the break. So I would say that the biggest thing to do is to get started with this is to really confront whatever stories you may be telling yourself about why it's so hard to take breaks. And again, I'm not invalidating them by calling them stories. I'm just trying to encourage you to think about the fact that maybe it's not true. Maybe you can step away for 5 minutes. What would happen if the person that you cared about the most in the world, not yourself, but the person outside of you, needed your help immediately? What would you do? Right? And why are you not doing that for yourself as well? And so I would suggest that as how to draw the line. As far as how much is too much, that is something that and I think it is an ongoing question that we ask ourselves and muscle that we build. Like, how do we identify what for ourselves is too much, and then how do we honor that? And I look you in the eyes and say that to you as someone who does that for herself all the time. So I guarantee you there are people on this call who are also feeling similarly. So,
well, and like you said earlier, sometimes you just need to walk around the block. You need to clear your head, and when you get into your own head, you just need to take that break to kind of reset and then start over again and have a fresh set of eyes on things.
Totally. I'm also a big fan of like little hacks as a break. Like, I have this lotion that smells like fresh cut grass, and putting that on and turning my chair around so I'm not facing my computer and like just smelling my hands for a few minutes actually helps reset the brain too. Like, there's so many easy things that you can do to just get a little space into your day. But it's really about knowing like, oh yeah, lines are things I should be drawing and lines are things I can be drawing. And that's how you get started.
As someone with allergies, the fresh cut grass is giving me a little anxiety, but I get the point you're making.
Well, but maybe lotion is your answer.
A nice lavender I would go with, maybe.
There you go. Lavender. Love it.
The next question, and this will be our last question. If we don't get to a question that you had, please feel free to email us and we can definitely get you answers or point you in the right direction to something. But the last question here, people are always asking me how I'm doing. I feel awful consistently saying bad. How do I address the pleasantries?
Yeah, so I get that. And I think, if you were sitting in front of me, we were having a back and forth conversation. I'd be curious to know why bad is always, like, what else is in there? Like, is there something else in there? that, that you could say that maybe isn't bad, but also still feels true. And because there's probably a range of things, like, it might be a little tired today. It may be, I'm trying to think what else, like, I don't know. I mean, so there could be something else besides bad if you feel like they're specifically asking you about something that's happening with your cancer experience or disclosed, and that's what it is. The swivel is going to be your friend there. Whatever you say, like it might be, I'm a little tired today, but I really appreciate you asking, how is everything with you? Or, do you have any new pictures of your new puppy? I'd love to see them, right? Like, how can you take the conversation and get it back in the other direction? The other thing that I'd offer for you is that take a listen to how they're phrasing questions, because often we impose what we think they're asking when there's a way to answer the question that's not exactly what we think where they're asking. So in case that's convoluted, because I'm hearing it sounds a little convoluted to me. Like if somebody says like, hey, how are you feeling? That's a question that comes up a lot. And it's a pretty benign question if you just look at the words, like, hey, how you feeling, right? Often in real life, you get like the head tip where that they're asking about how your cancer is going, like, how are you feeling? I'm doing okay, right? But you don't have to address the head tip. You can address the words and you can say, actually, I'm a little hungry. I was about to go grab some lunch. Do you want to come with me? Or really excited about this movie or because I just bought tickets to go see a movie tonight. Have you seen blah, 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 blah? Whatever it is, you have the opportunity to kind of take control of what's happening there. I recommend practicing swiveling. Swiveling is an outstanding life skill. It's not just a working during a diagnosis or after treatment or whatever skill. It's a solid life skill. You go to family reunions and you get all sorts of questions from nosy relatives who care about you, but are asking the worst possible question that they can ask. And being able to swivel out of that is really helpful. So, again, acknowledge it, stick an and in there, try to get the conversation out to another place. And remember that you can be in control of your response.
I think that's a great way to end today. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
We look forward to everybody's feedback. You'll be getting an evaluation in your email. We hope that you will help us out by filling that out. We do take your suggestions and critiques to heart, and they help shape these future calls and programming that we have here. And once again, if we haven't gotten to your question today, please shoot us an email, cancerandcareers@cew.org, and we will get back to you with an answer or point you in the right direction there. And once again, requirements for obtaining CEs, we went over earlier, but you'll be getting an email with all of that information as well. So once again, thank you, Rachel, for your insights, and thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a great afternoon.